Welcome to another webinar in Mistra's series of webinars on geopolitics that we have had and plan to continue having for the rest of this year and into into the next year. Today's webinar is on the topic of nuclear disarmament, and particularly, as with many of our programs, what the relevance of that is to the African continent and African people. We have a good lineup of 4 speakers, so I'm not going to take their time. We will let me just say before we move on to the speakers that we have to say this, that we are live streaming this webinar on YouTube, on Mistra's YouTube page. If you have any questions directed specifically to any of the speakers, please put those in the Q&A section. You can put them in the chat, but then they might get lost in the midst of all the other noise, discussions, comments, etc. in the chat. So if you put it in the Q&A, we'll definitely find it and be able to direct those questions to the relevant speakers. We will be posting throughout the event on social media, particularly on X, and you can engage with us there. Our hashtags Mistra_SA. On Facebook, Mapungubwe Institute, on LinkedIn, Mapungubwe Institute, and hashtags on all social media platforms, Nuclear Disarmament and Mistra Webinar. Okay, that's the kind of basic stuff done. Let us move on. I'm not going to do an introduction because our first speaker is going to do that, setting the scene. Dr. Sandy Africa is the Director of Research at Mistra, formerly from the University of Pretoria, but now at Mistra as Director of Research. And she will, for a few minutes, set the scene for this webinar and its relevance and why it's important for us. Sandy.
Thank you, Naeem, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's really a great pleasure for me to make a few introductory remarks setting the scene for this webinar on nuclear disarmament. So we're exploring one of the most pressing global challenges of our time, the urgent need for nuclear disarmament. In the context of heightened geopolitical competition, there have been worrying signals that the threat of the use of nuclear weapons in conflict may be assuming a prominence that the international community had worked very hard to diminish. In the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russia, perhaps rhetorically, threatened to use nuclear weapons. The UK and France are considering increasing their stockpiles, especially as the posture of the United States casts confusion and doubt over that country's role in international security. Moreover, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which has been framing talks between Russia and the USA, is set to expire in February 2026, with no certainty about what will come next. Countries of the global south and the African continent have been champions of the cause of disarmament, and so should rightly take note of these developments. And then again, the issue of nuclear disarmament has featured very prominently in recent weeks, following the bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities by the United States during the recent armed conflict between Iran and Israel. For a moment, it appeared that the attacks had dented Iran's faith in the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, to which Iran has been a signatory since 1968. Fortunately, we know that Iran in recent days has had talks with France, the UK, and Germany to find a diplomatic way forward. And so, we watch that situation with some concern, but I guess with a measure of relief as well. it's for this reason that we want to understand and explore the complexity around nuclear weapons, um, and indeed around the programs of those countries which profess to be interested in nuclear issues, nuclear energy for their own development. But framing our background today and framing our discussion is the weaponization of nuclear technology and the implications that all these current developments that I've mentioned have for the global agenda, for nuclear non-proliferation, for nuclear disarmament, and for the promotion of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, which are the three objectives of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The threat of weapons of mass destruction in general has loomed large over African states for decades, and almost all African states are signatories to the NPT, as the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is known as, in short. And this is because the Cold War period saw African territories under colonialism and apartheid serving as nuclear test sites, as well as sites of competition for the mineral resources that fueled the nuclear arms race. Moreover, Africa and the world at large has painful memories of the devastating impact of nuclear weapons. We all know that they were used only in the context of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as weapons of war with really devastating impacts which are felt to this day. But there are also memories etched in the minds of those still living with the effects of nuclear war and nuclear tests, living with the exposure to radiation. Think of countries in the Pacific region, in the Sahara, and other places around the world. And radioactive dust particles from the Cold War period have been found to be floating around in the atmosphere through tests conducted as late as 2022. And this is on the back of evidence and scientific testing of samples from Belgium, Spain, France, Austria, Luxembourg, and Germany. So the persistent reality is very much with us today. So it's in this context that the 1996 African Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty, also known as the Pelindaba Treaty, which covers the African continent as well as the surrounding islands, must be appreciated as a watershed. The treaty binds African states to refrain from developing or acquiring nuclear weapons, or allowing for testing, assisting other states to test or accommodate their nuclear weapons facilities, or to dump radioactive waste on their territories. In so doing, this treaty asserts African countries' sovereignty and also the accountability of the states to the continent's peoples. And we might mention that similar treaties exist in other parts of the world, all on the back of these very harsh experiences that populations have had to endure. But an even more recent development than the MPT and the Pelindaba Treaty has been the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons of 2017, the TPNW. This was signed into force in 2021. And this treaty is even more forceful in that it seeks to eliminate all nuclear weapons. Some might say that's a pipe dream, but once again, African states have been prominent in their advocacy for this TPNW. South Africa, Nigeria, along with other countries, Brazil, Ireland, Mexico, and Austria among them, actually led the negotiations that led to the adoption of the TPNW. So South Africa's role in this initiative and other initiatives are significant, given that under colonialism and during apartheid, there have been experiences that propelled the continent to actually take a firm stand against the proliferation of nuclear weapons and indeed disarmament, so that the world is free of nuclear weapons. And South Africa in particular has a very prominent and noteworthy role, because during apartheid, as we all know, it had possessed a nuclear weapons program and subsequently dismantled it prior to acceding to the NPT. African agency continues to be important. Some may not know, but as recently as last week, the Nuclear Suppliers Group concluded its 34th plenary meeting here in South Africa. And our Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Mr. Ronald Lamola, at that meeting warned again of the high risk of nuclear conflict. And then there are other major events that will take place in 2026. The first will be the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in April next year. And later in the year, South Africa will be presiding over the first review conference of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. And we might also take note of the fact that just 2 weeks ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations announced the appointment of a scientific panel on the effects of nuclear war. And it's heartening to see that this global panel of experts includes scientists from the African continent. But as these important events and processes are being prepared for, there is pressure. There's pressure on the norms underpinning the non-proliferation regime and the disarmament agenda, particularly around testing and accountability for safety, and accountability for health risks. There are suspicions that some of the nuclear weapons states are in fact conducting low-yield tests despite the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty of 1996, which in any case has not entered into force. And as we know, because it's been very visible about this, North Korea, which isn't a signatory to the NPT, has tested weapons to signal that it has these capabilities and to use its status as some kind of leverage. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that our online seminar couldn't be more timely. We aim today to inform about recent developments, but also to provide a platform for discussion as we identify key strategic and policy questions that may need further attention. One strategic challenge is our ability to assess the claim. Some would say that we need to challenge the claim that nuclear weapons are a necessary evil, as some of the countries are now saying, arguing that it's a deterrent in an increasingly unpredictable and violent world. But another question or issue is what Africa can teach the world from its own experience of disarmament and the creation of a weapons-free zone. A third issue is how to ensure in this volatile geopolitical climate that all countries find themselves in, the use of nuclear energy can be weighed against the peaceful uses paradigm set out in the NPT and what responsibilities this places on the shoulders of countries. And in the African context, as we observe that once again, as happened during the Cold War, there's a lot of interest in the minerals that the continent possesses, how we ensure that the continent does not become a site of extraction to fuel more wars, especially nuclear war. So, in conclusion, they are historical, they are political, diplomatic, technical, scientific, environmental, moral, legal, and other considerations as we debate these issues. And we hope that the presentations will answer some of the questions that you may have, address some of these themes, because speakers are coming at the questions or the debate from different perspectives, and certainly inspire more questions on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Okay, so after Sandy's setting this, Dr. Africa setting the scene, we have three speakers. Our first speaker and main speaker is going to be Dr. Trita Parsi. I'll introduce him in a moment, followed by Kudekwashe Mapako, and the last speaker would be Professor Johansi van Wyk. So Dr. Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and joining us from the United States, where it's not too early in the morning. It's office hours, so we don't feel too bad, Trita, for waking you up. Dr. Parsi is the Executive Vice President, as I said, of Quincy. He's an award-winning author and the 2010 recipient of the Raven Mayer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. He's an expert, recognized expert on US-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign policy, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. Dr. Parsi himself is Iranian, was born in Iran. He's authored 4 books on US foreign policy in the Middle East, with a particular focus on Iran and Israel. Israel, which of course helped South Africa to build its own nuclear weapons. He has been named by the Washingtonian magazine as one of the 25 most influential voices on foreign policy in Washington, D.C. for 5 years in a row since 2021. He's also the co-founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. Dr. Parsi has followed Middle East politics for years. I'm not going to get into more detail or list the books that he's written, etc. Let me hand over to Dr. Parsi to begin. Trita.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you and at this very important and timely webinar organized by Mistra. I'm going to give a bit of an assessment of the current situation and where things are likely to be headed from here. And my overall message is that, unfortunately, it seems quite likely that within the next month and a half, perhaps as early as that, there will be another war between Iran and Israel. I think it's important to first recognize that this was a unique war, because you had 2 nuclear weapon states, Israel and the United States, waging war without provocation. This was not in self-defense, against a non-nuclear weapon state in the midst of negotiations to ensure the peaceful nature of the nuclear program of that non-nuclear state. We don't have an example of this in the past, and unfortunately, the significant risk that this will increase the sense of a need for nuclear deterrence, not just in Iran, but in many other states, is unmistaken. Just take a look at a recent poll in Turkey, which showed that only support for nuclearization existed in Turkey in case Iran went nuclear. But now, I think from 20% to 59% of Turks favor building a nuclear weapon regardless, as a result of the Israeli-American attack on Iran. And if that is the case in Turkey, you can just imagine what the likely sentiments may now be in Iran, mindful of the fact that historically there's been very little support for weaponization amongst the population in Iran. There's been strong support for having a nuclear program, for having enrichment capabilities, but very limited support for having nuclear weapons. That has likely changed quite dramatically, at least amongst the population, and I think reasonably also within the elite itself. Now, the reason I say that there's a likelihood of another war is because at the end of the day, this war was not about the nuclear program. The Israelis have been pursuing an effort to get the United States to go to war with Iran for more than 20 years. And while the nuclear program to a certain extent is a pretext, it's not an unimportant factor, obviously, but it's not the key reason as to why they have desired this military confrontation. The military confrontation has been desired because of a need to A, cut down Iran in size, establish a power, a balance in the region that is far more favorable towards Israel, but that Israel on its own cannot create. It needs the United States for it. Secondly, by having the United States be part of that war, ensure that there will not be any rapprochement between the United States and Iran for the foreseeable future, which the Israelis view as a threat to their own influence and their own relationship with the United States. But a third objective in all of this has been to make sure that Iran becomes essentially the next Syria, a country that Israel can attack on its own without the help of the United States, with impunity, with no consequences. We have seen over the course of the last 10, 15 years that the Israelis have taken military action against Syria on a regular basis with impunity and without involvement of the United States. Same with Lebanon, of course. And the aim with this specific war was first and foremost decapitation of the regime, which failed. Secondly, to reduce it to another Syria that Israel can handle on its own with this mowing the lawn strategy. That also failed, at least in the short term. But precisely because that is the critical objective of the Israelis, there's a likelihood that there will be another war, and the Israelis would like to start it before the Iranians get a chance to rebuild or acquire new air defense systems. The political window for this may be as short as end of August as a result of the snapback provision that likely will be triggered by the Europeans by the end of August, and the deadline for negotiations that exist. Whether militarily it will be possible to get to that point or not remains to be seen. From the Iranian standpoint, it is critical for them not to be reduced to another Syria, which suggests that in the next war, the Iranians are not going to show any restraint. And very early in the war, they will use far more capabilities than they used in the first war. I think it's important to note that despite the coverage of this issue, at least in the West, the Iranian missile attacks on Israel were quite impactful and to a large extent successful. The Iranians shot off a large number of missiles, huge holes and limitations existed in the Israeli air defense systems. Even with the help of the Americans and with the THAAD system, there were still a very large number of missiles that went through. The reason why we don't see too much about it is because the Israeli military censorship that does not allow any reporting on attacks on military sites. And the little we have seen is because of videos that people took as it was happening. Moreover, we do now know that about 25% of the batteries and interceptors of the THAAD system were consumed in these 12 days. And it will take the United States 3 to 5 years to replenish that stock. The ability and the capacity of the United States to do so is very limited. There's some suggestions that the Arrow missiles would also have run out if the war had continued another 2-3 weeks, whereas the Iranians still have roughly, the intelligence estimate is about 1,600 long-range missiles left. The Iranians were not shooting off that large number for a variety of reasons. Part of it was because, of course, their launchers had been damaged, but also because they were playing the long game. They thought that this is going to be a longer war and not going to shoot off everything right away. In the next war, it seems more likely that they will go at it very hard from the beginning in order to completely dispel any notion on the Israeli side that Iran can be reduced to another Syria. This then also suggests that, be mindful of the fact that there is no certainty on the Iranian side as to whether that strategy will work or not, because there's so many uncertainties here altogether. How fast will the Iranians learn from this? How fast will the Israelis learn from this? How fast will the Israelis be able to repatch their air defense system and replenish their arsenals? How fast will the Iranians be able to rebuild launchers, etc., essentially being ready for another war? Who has time on its side or not? It's unclear on either side. Moreover, it is also unclear to what extent the very extensive Mossad presence in Iran has been consumed, and to what extent can it be reused? Was it a one-time operation, or is it something that they can do over and over again? If it is of the latter or of the former, and the Israelis cannot pull off another major surprise as they did on June 13th, then that will also impact many of these different calculations. But the bottom line is that neither side knows. The Iranians do not know how much of a Mossad presence remains inside of Iran or not. All of this then points to the fact that neither side can be particularly confident about where the next war will go. And mindful of how existential this is in many ways for the Iranians, it suggests to me that they will not put all of their eggs in the basket of thinking that the missiles will handle this issue. They need a plan B. And the only other plan B they have at this point, mindful of the fact that the three legs of their deterrence is one, the axis of resistance, which by and large is in shatters, two, the missiles, which as we discussed is uncertain, and three, nuclear ambiguity. And since nuclear ambiguity is now gone as a result of the Fordo and the Isfahan plants being bombed, that to me suggests that it is very likely that in parallel with preparing for the second war based on missiles, the Iranians likely may have also made a decision to build a nuclear weapon. Now, the ability for them to do so also is unclear, because at the end of the day, no one knows at this point with certainty where the Iranian stockpile of 60% enriched uranium is. And there's several other elements of the nuclear program that appear to have either been destroyed or it's unclear exactly what is. So when we hear the estimate that this attack may have pushed back the Iranian program 2 to 3 years, it is a bit misleading. It may have pushed back the program 2 to 3 years if the Iranians were to rebuild the same civilian program. But if the Iranians choose to go in the direction of weaponization, that's a completely different story. They will likely not need 2 to 3 years for that. It may actually be so that they can do some of these things within 6 months in order to just get one dirty bomb. And as long as this threat continues to exist, this constant rhetoric, both from Israel and the United States, that they may just go at it again, they may just bomb Iran again, it's going to be very difficult to see that the calculation in Iran will shift, particularly mindful of the fact that there was hardly any support coming from the international community, at least meaningful beyond statements. Of course, the BRICS eventually came out and condemned this. At first, they didn't because the Indians were blocking that statement. But Iran feels completely alone. It cannot rely on Russia. It cannot rely on China. Whereas the Israelis engaged in this attack, not just with the help of the United States, but at least from the Iranian perception, with the help of several NATO countries as well. And this then creates a scenario in which, while the program may have been set back, while Iran has taken a huge number of hits, the desire for a nuclear deterrence may be much, much more strong than what it was before. Determination may be much stronger than it was before. And crucially, the decision to build a bomb, which had not been taken before. According to all intelligence assessments, the Iranian had not made a decision to build a bomb. At this point, we probably have to assess that it is uncertain whether that old decision still stands. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Trita, putting the kind of more academic discussions into real focus in terms of the geopolitics regarding Iran, but really the Iranian nuclear program and possible nuclear weapons program is a global issue, as we saw from the attacks in June on June 13th and thereafter. Let us move on to our next speaker. Kodekwashe Mapako is going to be talking about reconciling the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the treaty for the on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So looking at from that kind of international law perspective, because that's what he does. Kuda is an international law researcher, Arms Control Negotiation Academy fellow, and a steering committee member of the African Nuclear Disarmament Verification Hub, coordinated by the Verification Research Training and Information Center. 2024-2025, he was a research fellow on a Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, or for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. Let's see. Everyone has long CVs, so I'm trying to cut them down. Kuda holds a Master of Laws degree, specializing in international law from UCT, University of Cape Town, and a Bachelor of Laws degree, major in international law from Zhejiang Rongsheng University in China. Kuda, on to you.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly, and see you.
Great. Thank you. It is an honor to be invited by Minstra to share insights and discuss the implications of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, following the recent security developments we are witnessing across the globe. In my remarks, I'm going to cover these two regimes vis-a-vis the security developments that we are witnessing and how this pose a direct impact to these two legal instruments, the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in particular. I would like to start off by just painting a picture on these two regimes for some that might not be familiar. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty is regarded as the cornerstone of non-proliferation and disarmament. And it actually has subsequent implementation treaties, which include the TPNW, among others. So the TPNW initiative complements the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It offers a comprehensive legal requirement to ensure nuclear disarmament. It reinforces the inalienable right of non-nuclear weapon states to utilize nuclear for peaceful use. It also offers positive obligations to state parties on issues related to victim assistance, environmental remediation, and most importantly, it amplifies the role of marginalized groups, covering a range of issues up to nuclear justice, equitable participation of non-nuclear weapon states, among other issues. So following the insightful remarks and presentation by Dr. Sandy and Dr. Pasi, I would like to just reiterate by painting a picture again of the security climate that we're operating in right now. We are currently witnessing regression on fundamental norms characterized by diplomatic impasse within the Non-Proliferation Treaty multilateral processes. We're currently witnessing empty virtue signaling, the lack of transparency, stalling on disarmament commitments by nuclear weapon states who are intensifying the nuclear risk by integrating emerging technologies in nuclear weapon systems. We are also seeing the prospects of extended nuclear deterrence in other parts of the world, in Asia, in Europe, and the Middle East. And we're also witnessing the military expenditure and increased military expenditure and continued circumvention of international law. I would say all these factors are inconsistent with the spirit of the non-proliferation regime. So going forward, I'm just going to unpack a few issues which are emanating from this development and how that reflect on these two legal instruments. In particular, I'm going to start off with the question which is actually around circles right now on the sustainability of the non-proliferation legal instruments, particularly the development of legal and political apathy, particularly from non-nuclear weapon states. So it's fundamental to note that the presence of nuclear-armed states outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty has long undermined its credibility and has been the reason why it has been put to question by some states of its credibility and legitimacy. However, the recent developments we are witnessing is actually increasing the frustration of non-nuclear weapon states over the lack of disarmament commitments and how they are acting in a manner which is inconsistent with the non-proliferation regime, as we are witnessing nuclear assailants in these other parts of the world. So the recent developments, we witnessed a non-nuclear weapon state, Iran, being attacked by one state, which is also a state party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and another, which is operating outside of that Non-Proliferation Treaty. This development has exacerbated existing structural problems we've been witnessing within the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself, and questions related to its sustainability have been raised around some of the inequalities which are embedded and the shortcomings which are embedded in the Non-Proliferation Treaty as imbalance between the nuclear weapon states and the ones who do not have these nuclear weapons. So all of this leads and it fuels the rise of proliferation discourse, particularly among non-nuclear weapon states, as they also seek and also start the idea to have proliferation as a way to ensure their sovereignty in a time of heightened uncertainty, which is quite unfortunate. And all these points point out to the rise of this risk of legal and political apathy vis-a-vis the existing non-proliferation commitments from non-nuclear weapon states in particular. I think one way of looking at it is to actually forecast into the future. Going forward into the 2026 review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the first review conference of the TPNW, we are likely going to witness reluctance from states that have been continuously adhering to non-proliferation and disarmament commitments due to these developments that we're witnessing. So the persistent impasses within various multilateral fora are going to heighten, and they'll also increase the likelihood of lack of diplomatic cooperation on some of these key issues on non-proliferation and disarmament. And perhaps we are also going to likely witness something positive from this dark climate we're in right now, potentially an inadvertent consolidation of non-nuclear weapon states endorsing and recalibrating their strategies within the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I think the most recent indication of this was the meeting of state parties, the third meeting of state parties, in which non-nuclear weapon states were collaborating and recalibrating their campaign against core issues which undermine non-proliferation and disarmament, particularly issues in relation to nuclear deterrence. There was a lot of work being presented and discussions emanating around this from non-nuclear weapon states within the TPNW. And also we saw almost consolidated effort on promoting the normative value of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as a response to the growing insecurity that we're witnessing right now. Moving further, or on the flip side, just to be a little bit of a pessimist on this, we are potentially likely to witness some form of regression and consideration from non-nuclear weapon states to have some stalling effort in their process of ratifying the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons for those that have not ratified. As we are witnessing non-nuclear weapon states getting attacked against Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, as we are witnessing nuclear weapon states continue with nuclear assailants, relying on nuclear weapons as part of their military and security utility. All of these efforts will make non-nuclear weapon states really have a long, talk or a long time to really consider whether they need to promote the universalization of the TPNW and be part of a community which does not have nuclear weapons, or whether they should pursue a nuclear option. And I think this is quite unfortunate. This leads me to my other point, second point, which touch on the selective application and enforcement of the law that we are currently witnessing, particularly in relation to the International Atomic Energy Agency's safeguards question. I would like to say the global non-proliferation regime, as a collective, it hinges on fair and consistent application of norms. Therefore, the enforcement should be consistent. So a situation where some states are shielded from scrutiny while others face relentless pressure as far as their commitments are concerned, it undermines and it brings a question on the legitimacy of the entire system as a collective. And I think this is quite unfortunate, as the growing skepticism on one of the most important institutions that ensure a verification mechanism on non-proliferation, it needs to be solid instead of being questioned whether it's legitimate or whether it's impartial or not. So all these points, they inadvertently, on the flip side, give one an option to look at issues from an omniscient point of view. It actually increased the normative and the legal appeal of other regimes, in particular the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. How relentlessly the Non-Proliferation Treaty has been brought to question, particularly with the recent developments we are witnessing right now, it reinforces the conversation of how and why states should actually endorse the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as it offers a more comprehensive approach to core issues and leaving room which is subject to exploitation, be it through interpretation or other means. I think this is clearly witnessed when we look at the conversation happening right now on safeguards, whether the Article 3 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is comprehensive enough, or whether the Disarmament Clause is comprehensive enough to ensure that the commitments are upheld by the state parties. And also the elephant in the room, the prospects of potential withdrawal by Iran has ignited this conversation to question Article 10 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, whether it's comprehensive enough to ensure a high threshold that a state cannot enjoy its right easily to withdraw from its legal commitments. I think all these efforts and the security development we're witnessing right now is igniting a bigger conversation reflecting on the existing non-proliferation and disarmament tools we have now, on which tools are more comprehensive, where there are shortcomings, and how these legal instruments can reinforce each other to ensure a more comprehensive effort on international security and peace. Last but not least, I would like to touch on the prospects of...
1 minute, Huda.
1 minute? Oh, okay. That's great. Yeah, I would like to touch on the prospects of nuclear development going forward, following the attacks on nuclear installations we witnessed recently. I think it brings into question how other states are going to actively pursue nuclear for peaceful development without fear also of being subject to attacks. I think this actually ignites the growing conversation non-nuclear weapon states have been having on securing credible, non-discriminatory, legally binding negative security assurances. I would like to just end on just saying I believe all these developments that we are witnessing, they're just amplifying pre-existing issues within the non-proliferation and the disarmament regime. So the main question and the ball is really in all the states that have been adhering and consistently committing to the non-proliferation and disarmament, on how they reconcile with this existing development and how they're going to act going forward into the near future. I believe the non-proliferation regime, it's not a short-term enterprise. So there's an opportunity for us to envision a future which is much more safer and viable for everyone. So this brings an opportunity to reflect on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Kuda. I mean, bringing that international law perspective into it, it just seems to me that non-nuclear armed nations are expected to have a greater burden of responsibility than those who actually are armed with nuclear weapons at the moment. Our next speaker and last speaker, and let me just remind colleagues, please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. And we'll look at them, and once we're done with the speakers, we'll get to your questions and ask the speakers to respond. Our third speaker for this afternoon is Professor Johansi van Wyk. Professor van Wyk is going to speak on challenges facing South Africa and the African continent in the global nuclear non-proliferation scenario or scene. Professor van Wyk is a research professor in international politics at the University of South Africa, UNISA. She's completed a D.Phil in international relations on South Africa's post-apartheid nuclear diplomacy and has published widely on, among other things, South Africa's nuclear diplomacy and nuclear weapons program and nuclear humanities. Professor van Wyk is the co-editor of the South African Foreign Policy Review, volumes 1 to 5, a co-editor of the University of Johannesburg press series African Political Science and International Relations in Focus, and the series editor of Routledge's forthcoming series Critical Nuclear Humanities. She's also a Fulbright alumna and a member of the South African Academy for Science and Art. Johansi, over to you.
Good afternoon. I am going to share my screen. Please just indicate if you can indeed see it.
Almost. It says
Are
you've
we there?
started screen sharing, but we can't see it. Yes, now we can.
Yeah, thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Nechitenze, Dr. Omar, and colleagues of MISTRA, our technical team, Dr. Africa, and fellow panelists, and of course, everyone participating this afternoon. We are meeting, as Dr. Africa said, at a very important time. 2 weeks ago, and in 2 weeks' time, we have major 80th anniversaries. The first test of a nuclear weapon, which in my view amounts to the use of a nuclear weapon in 1945 by the Americans. And then, of course, 6 and 9 August, the 80th anniversary of the nuclear weapons attack on Japan. It is very sobering to reflect at this time on these events. And tomorrow, the African Commission on Nuclear Energy is hosting a 16th anniversary conference on the establishment of the Treaty of Pelindaba and the African Nuclear Weapons Free Zone. So the previous speakers have made my job much easier. So my idea this afternoon is then to focus instead on 3 aspects. Kuda has already spoken about the international legal framework. Dr. Africa has also referred to that. So I will focus on African concerns, including, of course, South Africa's concerns of the current geopolitical landscape and on nuclear disarmament. Then I want to refer to African nuclear diplomacy, what I call 3.0. And then move on to the Middle East, weapons of mass destruction free zone, linking up with our first speaker on what has been happening in the Middle East and its direct bearing on Africa, and of course, the opportunities and challenges that it offers our continent. Now, as I said, I'm going to skip that, but let me focus on the relevance of the issue of nuclear disarmament to Africa. We are bound by several legal instruments. We have a commitment at a normative sense to disarmament. But of course, we are mindful as a continent and individual African states that current and future geopolitical context will be totally different from the one that we are experiencing now and, of course, in the past. Therefore, the Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone and reviving that idea at an optimal level can help not only Africa, the global discourse on nuclear weapons, but also the events that have transpired in the Middle East. We should also be mindful that our continent has a lot of foreign interests present on the continent. We have Djibouti that has military camps and stations by foreign militaries that are by countries that have nuclear weapons. The Chagos Islands, of course, as much as it is known that it has been a handover from the colonial power back, but we are mindful that there are certain agreements pertaining to that that may open the door for nuclear weapons being on the island or at least surrounding. Nuclear submarines are crisscrossing our territorial waters, or at least our maritime waters. And Africa is also exposed to choke points that have a direct bearing on its security. And then, of course, our relations with nuclear weapons states. So some of our immediate concerns, of course, is diplomatic, political, practical, and of course, those also mentioned by Professor Africa. One of the things that we should immediately do is to get the status and optimal operation of the African Commission on Nuclear Energy to recognize that, and also that African states contribute to the operation of the Commission. Then, of course, throughout the continent, the domestication of international legal instruments, and there may be assistance required for some states to do that. Although they have signed and ratified important legal instruments, they may not have the capacity to domesticate that. And of course, once it's domesticated, it must then be part of its domestic debate, etc. So we must also effect African agency at all levels, and of course also include African civil society and international civil society. Now, if we look to the horizon in 2026, previous speakers have referred to the important events that will take place next year. We are likely to see that there will be spoilers at the NPT review conference. We know them. They are also the spoilers of the TPNW, states that do not live up to their commitments and undertakings. And it will also be very important that the idea of the Middle East nuclear weapons of mass destruction free zone gets another round of support. South Africa serves as a president of the TPNW conference next year, and we must also then look at the status of the ratifications and the progress made on compensation, rehabilitation, etc. for victims. And here Professor Africa has particularly referred to what has been happening in the Sahara Desert, and there is also then relevance to African victims of nuclear weapons. I also want to acknowledge that a South African has been appointed to the Secretary General's Independent Scientific Panel on the Effects of Nuclear War. And I think there is also an excellent opportunity for the continent to engage with Dr. Nkuwana and see how we can perhaps mobilize our resources. Now, if we look at African agency, let us see how we can harness African agency. I particularly want to look at African Nuclear Diplomacy 3.0. Year 3.0, for me, referred to specifically now going forward after the Treaty of Pelindaba. But what does African agency look like? So first of all, it requires presence at important events where nuclear disarmament is discussed and practical steps forward are discussed, and where crises emerge. Also where verification is required. and of course also compliance with IAEA safeguards. Second, participation in, for example, the IAEA processes, also at conferences. Agency also means empowerment of those that are acting on behalf of the continent and its civil society. Agency also includes agenda setting. What goes next on the agenda? How can the narrative about nuclear weapons be changed? What are the benefits of nuclear disarmament? And we must be mindful that many African states have committed to expanding their nuclear energy programs, which once again causes a double bind. On the one hand, it can benefit African communities to garner the uses of the peaceful use of nuclear energy for development, but also those installations can simultaneously produce heavy water and plutonium, which can then be sold for non-proliferation purposes. So here, AFCON's role becomes very important. And of course, presence means also diplomatic interactions at all levels, being visible, being known for influence. And then also new initiatives. Not only the Pelindaba Treaty, because we have, I think, been in a position of relative ease that we have this treaty. Perhaps it's time to review the treaty, mindful of new developments, but also to develop a common African position on practical steps towards the Middle East WMD free zone, and also the operationalization of the TPNW. Also to involve then African and international civil society. I want to look at at what is happening in terms of the Middle East weapons of mass destruction zone. Why is it relevant for a discussion on Africa and nuclear disarmament? First of all, current conferences, current ideas about it has included the Arab League, which includes several African states, which is now on your screen. It is quite a considerable number of African states. Hence, as a continent, we must be mindful of the urgency of this WMD free zone, which of course includes nuclear weapons. So this initiative is about 50 plus years old since the first efforts to establish this zone was adopted by the General Assembly in 1974. Fast forward to 1995, where the NPT Review Conference called for practical steps. Then by 2010, there was a plan adopted to make progress on this, including a conference. So immediately thereafter, a conference has not taken place within the context of the NPT. But by 2018, a UN General Assembly resolution adopted or at least proposed and adopted the idea of a conference. And of course, since 2019 until last year in November, 5 conferences have taken place. But of course, Israel have not participated. Arab League states have participated, as well as the IAEA, P5 countries, as well as I said, Iran, which is not a member of the Arab League. So the idea behind a Middle East WMD free zone is a region free of all these weapons of mass destruction. And ideally, it should prohibit and criminalize all these WMDs. So what are the current status and challenges? I've given you a list of at least 5 challenges and ideas where its status is. Let me go through it for time purposes. There's a lack of agreement, Israel's continuing program, verification mechanisms, political will, and of course, conference delays. Ongoing efforts include UNIDIR's efforts, the IAEA continues, the General Assembly has continued, and of course the Middle East Treaty Organization in 2019 conceptualized a draft treaty. November last year, the fifth session has taken place, but of course, this is a very much of a niche diplomatic area, which does not include, for example, the African Commission on Nuclear Energy. Here, there is an opportunity for African agency by including at least the African Union, but also AFCON that has to act on behalf of the continent. Now, what are the potential for African agency in the establishment of such a zone? There is an urgent need to get this onto the agenda, to establish a coordinating mechanism within the AU that can address African states that are involved or at least affected by the proposed zone, that there is an effort to address and represent their needs. A common African position, even working papers at important conferences can make a different, or at least a positive contribution. The involvement of non-government expert and civil society such as MISTRA is very important, and I hope that this is not the last webinar on the issue. I think it's also important to appoint a special AU envoy on a Middle East WMD-free zone, to draw lessons of the Pelindaba Treaty and South Africa's experience on nuclear disarmament, and of course that Africa prepare for the forthcoming conferences by not only include government officials but civil society. Let me end here by inviting you to present and offer suggestions, and I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuansi, for that perspective. Let us move straight into the questions that we have. We've got a few questions in the Q&A. Anyone that wants to ask questions, please direct them there. We'll find them. David Kenvin asks, next year is the 30th anniversary of South Africa decommissioning its nuclear weapons. Should this not be a huge celebration led by the UN, especially as no other state has yet followed its example? I'm going to ask 2 or 3 questions and then leave it to whichever speakers want to respond. Second question, Trita, is for you. Do you think China will, and this is Kingsley Makubela, do you think China will intervene in the likelihood of another war between Iran and Israel? If so, what are the implications for what seems to be a latent World War III? And Celestine Chidi Ezemedolu, also for you, Trita. Please, could you share your view or take on the concept of mastering the entire nuclear universe, in quotes, as part of Iranian nuclear policy, and why does it matter in understanding or misunderstanding the subject matter of Iran's nuclear program? Trita, do you want to start? There's 2 questions directed to you directly. You can
Sure.
take those, and then perhaps Yuansi can answer the one on South Africa decommissioning.
Thank you so much. I'll start off with the question from my good friend Kingsley Mahuela. I do not see any significant scenario in which the Chinese will step in. The Chinese have pursued a rather clever policy, quite the contrary of that of the United States, which is to just stay out of a lot of these different conflicts and benefit by having as positive of relations with almost every entity in the region. They're also concerned that if they move too close to Iran, it's not just about their relationship with Israel, but perhaps more importantly, their relationship with the GCC and Saudi Arabia. They want to keep a fair balance in that relationship. I don't think the Chinese in any way, shape, or form would view it positively if there were to be regime collapse in Iran. The destabilizing effect would be very negative for China. But I think after the performance of the Iranian government in the first war, in which despite a major Mossad coup and surprise, nevertheless, the Israelis failed to disrupt Iran's command and control for more than 12 hours. And the resilience of the Iranian government was to the surprise of the Israelis. I don't think the Chinese are as concerned as they may have been at the point that Iran's regime would collapse, and as a result, they would potentially do something to prevent that scenario. I think their concerns are far less at this point. One point on the resilience, just to give an example. the Washington Post released tapes that the Israelis clearly had given the Washington Post that showed with audio tapes of Mossad agents with perfect Persian calling Iranian generals in the midst of the first attack, in the first 6 hours or so of that attack. Because in the tapes, they say 2 hours ago, we killed this or that general. And they're threatening these generals by saying, you have to send a videotape of yourself to this Telegram address, declaring that you're leaving, that you're giving up on this regime, and that you're capitulating. Otherwise, we will kill you, we will kill your wife, and we will kill your children. Now, these audio calls were done in the midst of the panic and the chaos of the first 12 hours in which the Iranian government was completely taken by surprise. Nevertheless, we have no evidence of a single one of those telegram messages being sent, meaning that despite all of that chaos, you didn't have any of these elements giving up, throwing in the towel, or capitulating. And I think this took the Israelis by quite a surprise, that the resilience of the regime was very different from what they had seen with the Assad regime, for instance, or even with Hezbollah. On to the second question. I think, if I understand the question correctly, this is not so much about mastering the entire nuclear process as much as it is about the Iranian insistence on enrichment. And this is, of course, a key element of the negotiations. The Iranians have, for more than 20 years, refused to accept any type of a capitulation on this issue. They insist on having enrichment on their own soil. And they have paid a very, very heavy price for it. And we saw just the other day that Trump was very surprised. He called them stupid, saying, after you've been hit, how can you insist on continue having it? There's several reasons for this. On the one hand, on the nuclear front itself, the Iranians, under the time of the Shah, actually were co-owners of nuclear consortiums in France. But after the revolution, nevertheless, their share was never given to them, and the consortium refused to provide them with any nuclear fuel, which then eventually led the Iranians to conclude that they have to build their own nuclear program, restart the program that the Shah actually had started, in order to produce fuel for their own reasons. So, for instance, in 2009, they were running out of fuel rods for a research reactor in Tehran that the United States gave the Iranians in 1968. That research reactor is used to produce nuclear isotopes for for cancer patients. But no one would be selling the nuclear fuel to the Iranians. So the Iranians had to go up to 20% enriched uranium on their own to be able to produce those fuel pads. So Iran has an extensive experience of seeing that when it is dependent on the outside world, particularly on the West, that promises are not delivered. And as a result, they've chosen to go on the path of self-reliance. That's one aspect of it. Perhaps a more important aspect is that the Iranians do not believe that this confrontation is about the nuclear issue. It's about the balance of power in the region. And if they cave on enrichment, it will not resolve the issue. It will not be the end of the conflict. Instead, the goal lines, the goalposts will shift. And the next issue will be that Iran has to capitulate on missiles. And if it capitulates on missiles, the next issue is that they cannot have kitchen knives. That's their perception. That's their perception based on more than 30 years of experience. Perhaps they're wrong, but nevertheless, there's plenty of evidence that they are also right. We've already seen that as soon as the Israelis thought that the nuclear issue may actually have been set aside, it was a flurry of articles about how no deal is acceptable unless missiles are also included. And so the goalpost has constantly been shifting. And as a result, it is not as to whether they really need the enrichment or not. I think it really comes down to the fact that they have to draw the line somewhere from their perspective. Otherwise, there's a fallacy to believe that if they cave on this issue, if they compromise, or if they capitulate on this issue, the issue will go away. It will just take a new shape, a new form, and eventually Iran will be completely without any deterrence in a neighborhood in which Israel is acting with increasing impunity, particularly as we see it conducting a genocide and paying no price for it.
Thank you, Trita. Jonsi, do you want to take the question about the 30th anniversary of South Africa decommissioning its weapons? And if I can throw in a little curved ball to that. There are some South African role players who suggest that actually maybe South Africa should not have destroyed its nuclear weapons and not dismantle its program. Perhaps you can respond to
Yeah.
that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Naeem. Thank you, David, also for the question. Well, South Africa declared that it had a nuclear weapons program in March 1993 when F.W. de Klerk stood up in Parliament and made that announcement. It was only by June 1993 that the IAEA officially verified the dismantlement of South Africa's nuclear weapons program. So we're a little bit more than 30 years um, when we talk about dates. So, of course, there are many questions that we are mindful of has not been answered about our nuclear weapons past, which, of course, are coming out as time goes on. One recently was, of course, the release of the Kennedy Papers by President Donald Trump, which shows amongst those hundred thousands of pages that the Israelis indeed have cooperated with South Africans on this program. One of the sources at least. So we have that proof, and also then to make that link again with my argument for a WMD zone, free zone in the Middle East and Africa's involvement. Now, so I suppose then to answer David, we must be mindful that South Africa's nuclear heritage is very contested, and Naeem has referred to that. Some want it not to have been dismantled, and some, in fact, wanted it to be dismantled. So I think as South Africans, we need to have an open conversation on what does this heritage mean to us. I've written about that, and I'm happy to share my paper with you. So how do we celebrate that? How do we celebrate that? But how do we also converse with those that have a different opinion? And if one looks at social media platforms such as X, in recent months, there has been quite a number of voices saying that South Africa should never have given up our nuclear weapons, given the unilateral acts that take place by some of the major powers. And that is of course, very concerning that even in our public opinion and our imagination as South Africans, it is still a very desirable thing to have. Finally, just to refer to Dave's question again, David, we indeed are not the only country that have voluntarily dismantled. Now, the voluntary nature is, of course, also questioned depending on who you speak to. Irrespective of what your opinion may be, South Africa has been the first state to dismantle its nuclear weapons program in that sense. But also we know that countries like Libya has decided not to proceed. Ukraine has given its weapons up. Belarus, of course, also. But we know that there are Russian nuclear weapons deployed on Belarusian soil in the current Ukraine context. So thank you for reminding us, David, that we need to have this conversation so that we can understand these different paths. And I would recommend a fascinating book by Yunus Karim, if I can put in an advertisement, where he speaks about the ANC's MK Special Operation Unit and its role in our nuclear past. And it is good that we have new voices, original, authentic voices that can orientate us on how to understand our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuansi. Since we're doing book advertisements, the I think perhaps an authoritative work on the relationship between South Africa and Israel's nuclear weapons programs is The Unholy Alliance by Sasha Poloko-Suransky. We're looking into particularly on the South African side, the archives, interviews with former South African Defence Force generals, etc., who after 1994 were quite willing to talk quite openly to Sasha. Castro has a comment. I think the question part of it, Castro, might have already been answered by Yuansi, but I'm going to read your comment anyway because there's value in it. Despite the ANC leadership's commitment to the principle of non-proliferation, leading to negotiations and a democratic dispensation. Certain US and British officials and some Israelis feared that sensitive nuclear technology might fall into the hands of ANC allies, such as Fidel Castro and Muammar Gaddafi, who were hostile to the West. Hence, apartheid South Africa was pressured to dismantle its nuclear weapons capability and to accede to the NPT and MTCR. He talks about the US ambassador to Pretoria in 1991, Princeton Lyman, who admitted that that there was a concern that a black majority government would possess nuclear weapons. With regard to the Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone, what about the concerns that Israel possesses a nuclear weapons capability? Castro, it seems your comment got cut off there mid-sentence, but I think we get the gist of it, and Yancy might want to respond to that. There's a question for Trita and then one for Kuda. For Trita from Jolene Pretorius, with Iran disallowing IAEA inspectors, Theodore Postel of MIT has said that Iran should now be regarded as an undeclared nuclear weapon state. Does this view have currency with the Israeli and the US governments as well, and with what consequences? Number two, is there any chance to bring the IAEA back in or any other agreed upon credible institution to verify that Iran is abiding by its safeguard agreement? My sense or hope is still that if Iran has some way not to go the nuclear deterrence route, it will. Given that a nuclear attack on Israel will mean death and destruction to Palestinians, two, a nuclear deterrence relationship, even for those who think deterrence works, seems particularly hollow, irrational in an Iran-Israel dyad. Jolene, just my own curiosity that you mentioned all of this about a state that some accuse of having nuclear weapons, but you don't mention the fact that in this conflict is a state that everyone knows has nuclear weapons. And then for Kuda from Noel Stott, South African and indeed African civil society is very weak on the nuclear disarmament issue. It's seen as a northern problem, and our problem is poverty, health, education, etc. How can we galvanize civil society organizations in Africa to take this issue up? Kuda, let's start with you this time.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that's a very important question. It's very spot on the current climate we're in right now, but in particular in the region, as far as active participation from the civil society, and not only civil society, but also state representatives when it comes to these issues. I think there is a disconnect there. As far as civil society and how they can really galvanize and effectively work on addressing these issues and disseminating information to the public and promote the normative value of non-proliferation and disarmament, I believe there is room for regional cooperation. There's an opportunity to enhance regional cooperation on these core issues, in particular within the small community of civil society organizations that are focusing on nuclear issues, not only nuclear issues, but weapons of mass destruction in general. And one way of doing it is collaborative work. For example, MISTRA can engage in collaborative work with other civil society organizations across the continent, which are actively working on these issues. And as far as demystifying the issues, I think it's a layered conversation which has more nuance as far as demystifying the conception of nuclear weapons, in particular in the global south. I think the question is spot on. A lot of people here on the African continent regard nuclear weapons as far removed from concerns from us. We are dealing with imminent issues of poverty, inequality, development. So there is a need to actually bridge that divide, and that will take effort from civil society to launch grassroots inquiry on what is the conception of nuclear weapons from the public. What's their understanding of the effects of these weapons? Do they understand that these weapons have transboundary, non-discriminatory, and cascading effects? Do they understand the weight of us as Africans taking space and being part of the conversation on nuclear disarmament and what it means going forward. So I think it's a layered question, and going forward, I would expect for civil society organizations to not only mobilize in their circles and treat the conversation as a niche conversation, but to find creative ways in which we can broaden the discussion with other institutions which are actively working on other imminent issues, be it climate change, be it other issues related to insecurity, poverty, and gender. I think there is an opportunity to find a nexus in which we can broaden the conversation with more people engaging in this space. And I believe also, lastly, just civil society with our privileged position of understanding some of these issues than ordinary people who are not really invested in nuclear security issues. Let's engage and liaise with available state representatives to have a top-down approach to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kuda. Yuansi, you want to add or respond to anything?
Yes. Can I add on what Castro said about the Middle East WMD free zone? I think exactly Israel is the problem. It has a nuclear weapons program which it has not declared. It is not a member or a signatory to the NPT. It does not have a safeguards agreement with the IAEA. And we know that it is a country that by 1982 have attacked another state's nuclear installations. You may recall the Israeli attack on Osirak, the Iraqi facility. So we know it's a state that one may regard as some of the literature calls a rogue state or a deviant state in terms of global norms on nuclear energy and nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. So the trick is to get Israel to bow the knee. And how can that happen if there is a stronger push, especially from a powerful voting bloc such as the Africa Group at the UN to get this through? But of course, we know at the Security Council, the US will again then support it. Hence, alternative ways must be found to have the same weight on a decision that have lasting positive consequences for not only the continent, but also for the Middle East. And this is where my call is to us as Africans, that we must think smart and hard about how we can achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you, Yancy. Trita, Jolene's question.
Could you remind me what her question was? I was trying to find it in the Q&A.
So there's two questions. One is, with Iran disallowing IAEA inspectors, Theodore Postel of MIT said that Iran should now be regarded as an undeclared nuclear weapon state. Does this view have currency with the Israeli and US governments? And what would be the consequences? Second question, is there any chance to bring the IAEA back in, or any other agreed upon credible institution, to verify that Iran is abiding by its safeguard agreement? My sense hope is still that if Iran has some way to not go nuclear deterrence route, it will. Given that a nuclear attack on Israel will mean death and destruction to Palestinians too, a nuclear deterrence relationship, even for those who think deterrence works, seems particularly hollow or irrational.
Thank you. Let me start off with the first question. From the US and Israeli side at this point, there is no acknowledgement of what Professor Postel is arguing and a rejection of it. Publicly, of course, there is this position that the nuclear program has been obliterated. I don't think any serious person considered that to be a verified truth. But when you scratch the surface, nevertheless, you see that the administration views that it has set back things quite significantly, but it is still saying that it may take more military action if there's any effort by the Iranians to rebuild it. Same thing from the Israelis. So I don't think you have a scenario in which they, as a result of seeing Iran as a threshold country, would then conclude that, the military option is no longer viable. On the contrary, we're in a situation in which the military option is increasingly considered the only option by the administration. On the issue of the IAEA, there are negotiations right now between the Iranians and the Europeans as to whether postpone the deadline of the snapback trigger, which is in October. The effort here is to make sure that this is done before the end of August, because if the Europeans trigger it, it will need 30 days, and they want to make sure that the 30 days ends before October, because in October, the Russians hold the presidency of the Security Council. So they want that if things go forward, it happens before the Russians are in charge of the Security Council. If they postpone it, it will probably be postponed 6 or so months. It would require probably from the Iranians some concessions to the IAEA, and the Iranians are having their own conversation with the IAEA as well. However, I think it's also important to recognize how the Iranians view the IAEA at this point. The IAEA is not seen as a credible organization. The IAEA was silent when Israel and the United States were attacking Iranian nuclear facilities, did not condemn it. Moreover, the Iranians believe, and I don't know if there's clear evidence for this or not, that the many Iranian scientists that have been assassinated by the Israelis, and it's more than 30 just during that 12-day war, that the names of those scientists had been given by the Iranians to the IAEA as part of the transparency measures that they had agreed upon, and that the IAEA had provided those names to the Israelis. And as a result, that's how they knew who to go after and target. If that is the case, and at least at this point, I don't know if there's any evidence, but this is definitely the perception on the Iranian side, they do not view the IAEA as an impartial player, an objective player. In fact, also the last Board of Governance resolution that was passed was unusually and unnecessarily harsh. And the Iranians view that as having provided a political opening for the Israelis to attack. I personally don't think that that resolution is that relevant in this context. It may have lubricated the political situation one way or another, but at the end of the day, the Israelis had a plan to attack, and they would do so with or without snapback, with or without IAEA resolution. In fact, if you take a look at the state of international law, and this is setting aside the disaster in Gaza, in which the Western world, by and large, have completely failed to live up to any of their obligations, I think we also have to recognize that there was something absolutely bizarre that happened in the case of the attack on Iran. At least in the case of Israel's assault on Gaza, in the beginning, the Europeans could say that Israel had the right to defend itself because Israel had been attacked. Now, of course, defending yourself has limitations and guidelines and norms, which the Israeli, by and large, from the very outset, have not regarded or taken into account. But nevertheless, there was an attack, and the Israelis responded to it. In this specific case, there was no Iranian attack on Israel. There was actually ongoing negotiations, and the Israelis blew up the negotiating table. Nevertheless, the Europeans started off all of their statements by saying Israel has a right to defend itself. That was the first sentence in all of their statements in regards to Israel's attack on Iran, which essentially legitimized the attack, particularly when the German chancellor said that Israel has done the dirty work for all of us. That was a legitimization, an endorsement of the attack. So under these circumstances, it doesn't seem to me that there was much of a need for political lubrication whatsoever, because the Israelis do more or less what they want, and the Western world more or less is falling in line and deferring to the Israelis. But having said all of that, this is just to add a little bit of a nuance and picture to how the Iranians at this point are viewing the IAEA.
Thank you, Trita. It's 4:30. I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to go quickly through the rest of the, because I think people took time to type this out, the rest of the comments and questions, and then leave it to the speakers to choose what they want to respond to as we move towards closure. Perhaps a note. Not sure whether it's sarcastic or what, from Peter Vale. As ever, he says, the language around these issues is an alphabet soup that no one can understand, where no one can understand anything. So we should find a way to make it accessible. We should teach the success of South Africa to the young. What about a lecture perhaps in Desmond Tutu's name? Mhlanga Shongwe says non-proliferation and disarmament is a suboptimal strategy. Slava takes a different angle to this than the rest of us or the rest of the speakers, perhaps. Non-proliferation and disarmament is a suboptimal strategy in game theory. The threat of nuclear escalation is countered by the opposing threat of mutually assured destruction. This has been the balance since 1945. This was the force that kept the Vietnam War from escalating. To ask nuclear weapons empowered nation states to disarm is to present them with a suboptimal choice. Non-proliferation places the burden of suboptimal choice on developing states, who can only rely on third parties for their ultimate security. Why would we support a suboptimal strategy? Nhlanhla Nide asks, why was the IAEA quiet during the 12-day conflict between Iran and Israel, particularly in light of its mandate as a nuclear verification and safeguards body? Was its apparent silence indicative of limitations in its role, political constraints, or the nature of its engagement during active conflict? Arnold Mugwagwa, was it a coincidence that towards the transition from apartheid into black majority rule, when South Africa decided to give up on nuclear weapons, or was it after the realization that the transition was imminent? That question's been dealt with, Yuansi, already. Jabu Lusenga, integrated resource plan advocate for nuclear energy as part of energy mix. Is this posture progressive, considering the cost associated with the cost for such energy technology? USA and Israel war again. Okay, this is a word soup that I'm not able to understand, so I'm going to skip it. And anonymous attendee. Anonymous attendee, you're lucky. We usually at Mr. Seminars don't allow anonymous questions, but you got through somehow. There seem to be celebratory discussion and coverage of the US bombing of Iran's nuclear sites in Western government circles and media. Don't those attacks pose the danger of release of radioactive material, or is the level of enrichment too low to pose that danger? Kugan Pillay asks, or says, it has been allegedly reported that a ship carrying weapons from India and destined for Israel is docking in Durban tonight, 29th July. What should South Africa's response be given Mandela's call for global solidarity on Palestinians' freedom? Kugan, you also slipped something in that's not part of the discussion. It caught me a bit unawares, but there you go. Lebogang Raliapeng, and this is the last one. South Africa's voluntary dismantling of its nuclear weapons in the early 1990s was a well-intentioned gesture toward peace and international rehabilitation. But in hindsight, it left the country strategically vulnerable in an increasingly unpredictable world. In the face of emerging global threats, ranging from shocks like Donald Trump's election to the recent Israeli strike on Iran, it's clear that nuclear deterrence remains a powerful tool for ensuring national security and warding off surprise aggression. So there isn't only one person with that kind of a view. There's more. Lebogang, you have the same question in the chat. Okay, that's it to our speakers. Let's start the same way we did the last time. Kuda, you want to
Yeah,
speak?
yeah, sure.
Answer
Sure thing.
anything that you want and make your closing comments as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. I think I would like to just perhaps try to answer the first question, which seemed to suggest having proliferation and having your own nuclear weapons program is the way, and relying on deterrence. I think from just the level of frustration that is emanating around the security development we are witnessing, it might seem as if that's the only plausible way to ensure your security to develop a weapon, but unfortunately, it's not. I think for nuclear weapon states that continuously rely on nuclear weapons as part of their security and foreign policy, they forget to vehemently and say in a confirmed manner that they ensure that there is no likelihood of risk which is associated with these nuclear weapons and maintaining a deterrent strategy. And unfortunately, there is risk in relation to miscommunication. There is risk in relation to a miscalculation around relying on the notion of nuclear deterrence. And this risk is not commensurate. It does not measure up. It's not commensurate with the potential catastrophic effects that these weapons will have, not only to the state that the intended attack is on, but to other states which do not have the nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, we are part of that group, as we do not have the capacity. Some of those countries, the majority of them, don't have the capacity to develop these weapons. Therefore, the only sufficient and a more viable way to have a sustainable and peaceful society is to follow arms control measures, to actually implement the risk reduction pathways and measures leading to a complete, verifiable and irreversible nuclear disarmament. I think that's the only way around it. As to my ending remarks, I would say this is a very good discussion. It's been a very good discussion. Thank you for the platform and just igniting this conversation on the African continent. I think it's timely and it's necessary. I'm really looking forward to more of these engagements to try and just let's demystify the conversation. Let's proliferate the normative understanding of non-proliferation and disarmament across the continent and elsewhere. I think it really helps the campaign against what these weapons represent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kuda. Yancy? You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, let me once again just say thank you to Kuda. Kuda is one of a young generation of scholars that are coming through very strongly. And I am very impressed, as always, to listen to him and to my student, Mr. Ezemadulu, that is also in the meeting this afternoon. Thank you, Kuda, for the work that you do, and don't lose the passion. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, Naim, you and your colleagues, for giving us this platform. It's so important that we have this discussion, even though it's an alphabet soup. At least we can understand, we can differ, and I'm very grateful for the divergence of opinions that we have here. Let me just quickly talk about the radioactive material. Well, there is international standards concerning radiation exposure. Now, my argument has always been that you can't be half pregnant. You're either pregnant or not. You're either exposed or not. It depends on each individual how much vulnerable they are. So if we take into account that more than 2,000 nuclear weapons tests have been conducted, plus the two attacks on Japan, makes it 2,000 plus nuclear weapons that have been used. It means that radioactive contamination makes us all globally baksha. And therefore, for our own health and that of our future generations, is that we must fight this. And nuclear disarmament is one of them. But we must be mindful that nuclear decommissioning is also a hard task. It's a costly exercise which states must receive support for, to have that as legitimate and as a genuine disarmament. We have work to do, and I thank Mistra again and my fellow panelists and of course the audience for engaging actively. I really learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yancy. Trita, your responses and closing comments as well.
I didn't see any questions that I hadn't answered, particularly, the point made about the IAEA. I think I addressed that. I just want to also express my thanks to the panel, to Mistra for putting this together. I do think, and I wholeheartedly agree, I think Africa can play a critical role, not just in this issue, but in general. We are in a state of the world right now in which international law, international institutions, the multilateral system is systematically being hollowed out. Whereas in the past, Europe could in some ways act as an anchor for the international legal system, it is now more or less in practice abandoned it. And it leaves the global South as the global majority now having to shoulder that responsibility and making sure that the system is not just surviving, but also is rejuvenated, because it's the only thing that will ensure that we will not have complete instability, particularly as the world transitions away from unipolarity. And here, Africa. South Africa can play a critical role, particularly on the non-proliferation side, because of South Africa's own history. So I'm very delighted to see that this conversation is taking place here. And I certainly hope that South Africa will continue to show tremendous leadership here.
Thank you, Trita, and we hope to host you soon in South Africa.
Looking forward to it.
Let me call on Dr. Sandy Africa just to wrap up the discussion. Sandy?
Okay, thanks, Naeem, and thanks to the speakers. I mean, what more can I say? I think that each of the speakers has given such an excellent summary of where this debate stands, and I'm like Johansi, Prof. Van Wyk, I think I'm very grateful that it has been a debate. It hasn't been, one line, but many reflections, many different lenses to look at this challenge. I'm also grateful to Prof. Van Wyk for highlighting the fact that nuclear weapons are just a class of weapons of mass destruction. And to be honest, in the context of a continent that is seized with the agenda of silencing the guns, the proliferation of all sorts of weapons is a huge threat to the continent. So I think that what we are debating here, if you want to reduce it to its core, is the question of the use of force, the use of violence to settle disputes, which we should always, stand against. And I really appreciate Dr. Parsi actually pointing out that at the end of the day, this issue in Iran is not about a nuclear weapons program, but it is about asserting might, or asserting that might is a way to resolve issues. So we have been given much food for thought. We've been given, I think, even some suggestions on where to take the debate, where to take action to. So it's a clarion call, I would say, for us to think about how we can make our respective contributions wherever we are. And certainly from MISTRA's side, this won't be the last that we engage with the issues, and we hope to meet some of you in the different initiatives, as well as initiatives that you undertake. So thank you for that, and thank you for participating.
Thank you, Sandy. I of course don't have much to say except to thank all of the speakers, including Sandy, Trita, Kuda, Yuansi, for making your time available and for giving us really quite a fascinating discussion, and the convergence in this discussion between geopolitics, international law, technical stuff about nuclear energy, etc., I think is extremely important, but also gives us a sense of how often one or other of those overpowers all the rest. International law makes no sense to many people in the current geopolitical context that we're working with, for example. So thank you for that. And as I say, this is one in a series of webinars that we are events that we're organizing around geopolitics. So it won't be the last. Thank you, colleagues, all those who attended as well. Thank you. Bye. Panelists, if you can just stay for a minute, if you don't mind.
Have they left the room?
No, not yet.
So, Funny, can you shut off the participants and just have the panel?
I have to do them individually, but I am doing it now. Give me a few more seconds. But they
Tell
also
them
dropping.
there's coffee outside. Coffee and muffins out. Coffee and muffins outside.
Yes. Mistra's favorite diet, coffee and muffins.
Well, you don't like the samosas I bring, so what must I do?
Abba, you can say something about what you thought of the webinar
Yeah,
since we didn't hear you speak while we
yeah.
waiting.
No, I thought it was really good. So well done to everybody. I don't want to sound like I'm gushing in front of everyone else. So well done, Trita, Ansi, and Kudu. You said we can say it as Kudu.
Yeah,
So
Kuda.
thank you very much. I think it really went well. And yeah, I think it just shows that we do need a lot more of this kind of discussions. It's so often seen as like a very narrow, esoteric kind of area that very few people are there. And the one thing I was pleased to note, there's a former colleague of mine from Armscor, has retired now. Andre Bays was present. So I'm not sure if you guys know him, but he was part of the nuclear program. Yeah. And he's retired. Well, he retired a while back, but it was interesting to see him there. So yeah, it was. I think the quality of attendance was pretty good from some of the names I recognized. And I think, Anthony, you mentioned some students of yours were in the audience as well. So I think the discussion was great. There's so many issues, and it's kind of like, sometimes with Mistra, we kind of have so many broad things that we want to do. But I think maybe if you have any suggestions, what we could do to keep up the conversation, as you're suggesting as well, that'll be great. But otherwise, I thought it was a really, really good webinar and well attended.
Good. Thanks, Abba. Sandy?
Thanks, Abba. Andre Bass, together with your Ansi Kuda and myself, are serving on the steering committee of the Research and Innovation Hub for Nuclear Disarmament and Verification established by Vertic. So, in fact, there's a growing community. It's a small community, but yeah. And yes, we certainly do appreciate all his contributions, especially as a nuclear scientist. And we've been thinking in that committee, we had a meeting recently that we want to explore ways of getting not just as we typically are, political scientists and social scientists together, but also the African technical and scientific community involved, because they are actually very hard technical issues that are, they are political at the end of the day, but there's also a kind of a technical element to this work that we also should be engaging with. But I'd like also to just thank all the speakers. I think the presentations were excellent and aligned, and provide us with a good way forward to take the next steps. We usually, for the benefit of the panelists, what we typically do is just make the video link, clean it up and make the video link available, as well as, produce a op-ed or two. So that's what's likely to happen in the immediate future. But I do think that, if there are ways that we could individually contribute to just repeating some of these ideas in the public domain, this will all be very, very much supported and appreciated.
So just following on that, Sandy, if I can just say to the three speakers, if you want to write up your presentation in some kind of way as an op-ed, we can get it placed in some or other of the South African media.
Thank you.
Okay, let's hear from Trita, and then I think we'll close unless there's any urgent things anyone else wants to say. Trita, you're muted.
I just wanted to thank you all again. I have another meeting that I need to jump into the Zoom a couple of minutes before, so I do have